How's it going, folks? I'm Matthew, this is Lemora's Cards, and today we're going to be going through a tier list. These are usually pretty fun, and this is a topic that I haven't covered since like last year. I got a comment recently on the last time I did this saying that they would like an updated sort of guide to what the best beginner decks are currently. So instead of covering like 5 decks and giving a nice little commercial for them, basically, we're going through a whole lot more decks and going a bit through the spectrum of what I think you could start with depending on where you are as a player and what you're looking for in the format. If you enjoyed this video, consider liking, commenting, subscribing. We're super close to 7K. We might actually be there while you're watching it. It could be there by the end of the day before I even get this edited. Thank you as always to my amazing patrons over on Patreon who get access to early videos, get to submit decks for the tournament report, questions for the podcast, all that good stuff, as well as support, help me make cool stuff on the channel. With all that being said, let's hop into it. Use the link in the description below to download Whatnot, and you'll get $15 to use to buy Magic singles, sealed product, get anything that you want really. There's no limits. You just get $15 on the account for free just for signing up. This is one of the best ways you can support the channel, and again, it's just free stuff. Use the link in the description below, give Whatnot a try. Welcome to TopDeck.gg, your community's home for everything competitive Magic has to offer. Whether you're hosting an event, playing for a huge prize, or trying to advertise your store to thousands of players, we've got you covered. Using intuitive pairing software, playing Magic is a breeze. All your players have to do is sign up online, then scan the QR code in store. Give your competitors the gift of perfect information as their bracket updates in real time. Then, when the match is decided, our self-reporting software saves you time and leaves paper match slips in the past. Leave the heavy lifting to us so your community can sit back, relax, and have a great day of playing Magic. Let's go through these tiers and kind of give an explanation of how we're going to be ranking these decks. A few disclaimers. Of course, this is just my opinion, my perspective on when I recommend things for beginners, trying to do my best to make it hard for them to come out of the game with a bad experience. There are lots of players who you could give them any cEDH deck, regardless of quality, or if it's just something they really like, they're going to stick with the game no matter what. But I don't know, your specific tolerance or experience you're looking for in the game. So I'm more likely to recommend something that's just going to work for the average person. It's going to do well. It's relatively easy to grasp, and that'll keep them more likely to go, because I think it's very easy to lose players by giving them something that they're not going to have fun with or that's going to be frustrating. So I try to avoid that the best I can. Okay, so our tiers. We've got excellent. These are the decks that are both top tier or close to it. Reasonably can expect them to top 16 any tournament. And they're also, again, relatively simple to pick up. There's no deck that's going to carry you. Just because I say the deck is beginner friendly doesn't mean that it's super easy and basic. There's no deck that is so good that it will get you to top 16. You still have to play the deck, right? You still have to know how to play the game. These next two tiers, I would kind of consider them the same level, but I wanted to separate them so that you could have a better idea of kind of the experience you might have with them. So strong but tricky. These are decks that are also in that like really top tier level of performance, but they have, a few extra steps involved in learning them. Maybe there's some weird combo lines that are kind of tough, or maybe they have lots of pivot plans. You might see like a lot of higher color piles in here because those decks tend to have just so many options. It can be a little overwhelming for newer players. But I still think if you wanted to pick those up and you care more about like, hey, this deck is really good and I want to do the cEDH thing, this is kind of where I would point you. Simple but limited. These are decks that maybe aren't that powerful. Maybe they're more in that kind of tier 2 category. They might spike a top 16, but it's kind of like notable when they do, and they don't usually have the best conversion rate, but they are really easy to pick up for new players and do provide like, a good experience for them. Again, they might not be like the top tier decks in the format, but they're a little bit easier. So I think these two tiers, you can look at them as a trade-off. You could get a deck that's a little bit stronger, but might be a little harder to pick up, or a deck that's a little bit easier, but maybe it's like a little bit weaker. Not ideal. These are decks that you could play. I wouldn't say, hey, absolutely don't do that. But they definitely have some issues where I would say like you need to have either a strong like devotion to the commander, or need like a background in formats where that playstyle is, something you're familiar with. If you're determined to play a commander and you're just going to do it no matter what, even if you lose 50 games in a row, you don't even really need the tier list, right? You're here. You're one of those players I'm not worried about. Every player we lose to me sucks. I think that's a failing on the community or on my part, whatever. And bait. These are decks that Either they're not competitive, or they're, especially the decks that new players just tend to gravitate towards that I actually don't think are very good for new players, or just good for players in general to stick with. These are decks that would actively get people to not play. They're either going to be so weak that I don't think it's worth your time, otherwise not really help you learn cEDH that well, or just way too challenging for your average new pilot to pick up. Don't do it. This is basically just the Gitrog Monster tier. Yeah, this is the tier of decks that I would say new players don't ever do this to yourself. All right, with all that being said, let's hop into it. And we're just going to go through, I'm just going to grab them as I want to talk about them. And maybe we'll give some examples for each tier first, right? So Kinnan, I think, can go straight into excellent tier. This is a deck that can kind of wax and wane in terms of its conversion rate. I would say throughout parts of last year, the deck did incredibly well, was one of the top performing decks. Right now, if you look at like the last 6 months of data, it's actually on a bit of a downturn. It's a very powerful deck. It has different win cons, but pretty simple ones in terms of like the combos you do. You know, like not a lot of decks are using Mirage Mirror for combos, but once you know those, and I have a video going over them, your win lines relatively straightforward, barring some Stax pieces, but those are things you're going to learn. Those are like the moments where your Kinnan wins aren't as easy as goldfishing are going to be good learning experience moments, because you're going to have to learn to like time whether you push a Hull Breaker Horror and they go to bounce something, or whether you instep get rid of something. Like, I think it's a great deck for new people. It has really fun play patterns. You get to go really turbo, you get to go really big. I think it's just a great deck to hand to a new player. If I was going to just on average new person, don't know anything about them, I would hand them this, especially if they're coming from a casual commander background. They're probably going to have a lot of fun. I would say Tymna Kraum, the top tier deck of the format, is in the strong but tricky category. Probably on the trickier side. I think good T and K pilots make it look like this deck is very brain dead easy to play. I don't think it really is. Sometimes the things just line up for you, they work out, but there is a lot of switching between different game plans. Okay, am I going for early Tymna? Am I going for early Kraum? Am I developing that Tymna game plan? Like, am I going towards creatures? Sometimes that's just like, well, those are the cards I have, but a lot of that can be trying to read the table. Of like, if you're doing the Tymna plan or the Kraum plan, even a lot of that requires like tapping out and trying to play tap out control. If you don't have interaction, that's where you get bodied in the early game with like, oh, I completely misevaluated my pod and I tapped out 2 turns in a row for creatures and we just got that in between, like when to go for like intuition lines, when it makes sense to intuition for like value, when you're tutoring for value pieces versus just going for the win. Very powerful deck, clearly, but it's trickier. Any deck I think with black tutors is going to be just a little bit tougher. And then, when the more win cons you add in, the more ability to be flexible yet, and I think it just gets harder and harder. I could hand it to a new person, but maybe with more coaching than I would hand them something like Kinnan. So let's move to like a favorite of mine. So let's talk about Roxai. I think Roxai is not ideal for new players. I don't think it's quite it's so hard to play, it's bait for new players, or don't do it. Maybe you could argue that, because it can be tough, but it can also be very freeing to hand new players a deck where it's like, yeah, your main goal is to just win as fast as possible. Roxai, I would say a lot more often than a lot of the other top tier decks, is putting together like manual breach kind of wins where you're having to, at least when I play the deck, I never just have Thoracle Console. I'm having to put together 3 different things where I'm having to Yogg will my tutors back and do all kinds of nonsense. It's a super fast deck. It can be really fun and attract new players for that reason. It can be really defeating to play it and mulligan inappropriately. The deck can really bait you with the hands. You just have like 1 million mana. What could go wrong? Well, you don't have a way to win, so you're just praying every single turn. You could arguably put it into bait for that reason. I'm gonna stick it into like maybe the bottom of not ideal, because it also is very powerful and it does a lot of the traditional cEDH stuff. It's just kind of a tough deck to pilot. Sometimes it's not that great. I think it's on a little bit of a comeback currently, but just a little hard to play. Pure turbo to this extent can be a little bit trickier. Compare that to like the other Grixis piles. So I have Kess here. This could represent really any non-partner Grixis commander. So like Kess, Evelyn, Cormella, I would kind of group together. To a lesser extent, Anala. So that's a bit different. I would put this in bait tier. There are people who are really drawn to these commanders. And if you are, if you like the commanders so much that you're thinking about leaving an angry comment, then you don't need a tier list, right? Because you just love it and you're going to play it anyways. So it's fine. These decks, minus Anala, because that one is sometimes good. I would also put in bait or in don't do it, because that's a pretty hard deck to pilot. These decks have, the entire time I've been doing tournament reports, they have ranged from almost okay at best to the worst decks in the format and are dragging all the Grixis down with them. When I did my video talking about Mardu Summer, Roxai when Tevesh Kraum were doing their best, and but the Grixis stats ended up sucking because these commanders were all like 0 and 10, 0 and 11, 0 and 12. The partner pairings that are in Grixis are very strong. These Grixis commanders are just okay. I would say Kess doesn't really even have that much of an identity. Cormella, if you really like doing like the Son half combos, cool, go for it. If you really like Evelyn and you love World Gorger Dragon and that's the thing you want to do, still go for it. I think overall though, these decks are just bait. I think people get drawn to these Grixis commanders that really just aren't that great compared to the other options, especially when we get into like the other Grixis deck that we're going to be looking at. I would much rather put new players that direction. You're not necessarily gaining much with some of these other than those niche combos that, again, if you like those commander specific combos, knock yourself out. This might be controversial. I'm going to put Yuriko in simple but limited. This is a deck that can do well. It was like notable when it hit our top 10 the one time we covered it. I think this is a deck a lot of people will eventually outgrow. They'll want something that's a bit different. They don't want to do the same turn 1 guy into turn 2 Yuriko every game. It's not a bad deck by any stretch. Again, it's sort of in that tier 2, 2.5 category. It has a very straightforward game plan. It's another deck that, like Kinnan, I'd be super willing to give to any new player. Again, keep in mind, this isn't tier 3. These two tiers are together. Arguably, you know, I'd be more willing to give a new player Yuriko than Tymna Kraum, more than likely. Again, you could move this tier up like this and it wouldn't bother me. It is just a little limited. I also think that there is something to say about the control game plan that Yuriko tends to have being a little bit tough for new players. The storm the board with ninjas part, pretty straightforward, simple. The I have 8 pieces of free interaction in my hand, what the heck do I do aspect of the deck, that can be tough. If your threat assessment isn't that developed, if you don't have a lot of experience, it can be hard to know when to use like something like a commandeer or, you know, your force negation, your mind break traps, whatever. But I think the game plan is overall just like straightforward and solid enough that I would still hand the deck to any new person. For me right now, it's not in that excellent tier with Kinnan. Yeah, Gitrog Monster. Don't do it. It's not very good. It's exceedingly complicated. Don't do it yourself. Let's get another excellent deck. I think I would put Tevesh Kraum in excellent, actually. This deck has so much ability to keep you going when things don't go well. The fact that you can, so when you compare to like Roxai, right? The fact that you can just keep a handful of mana and that's a game plan to develop your Tevesh or your Kraum, excellent for new people. My hand can go turn 2 Tevesh, cool, I'll keep it, I'll draw cards. Eventually I'll find a way to do something, right? Having 2 commanders that draw you cards, great. New people love drawing cards just like experienced players do. Having that fallback plan of doing that in what is usually built in more of a mid-range Grixis list, which I think is a little bit easier to pick up than a full dedicated turbo deck. Depending on the build, you get to do really cool stuff like Displacer Kitten with Tevesh. That's not exceedingly complicated for a new person to figure that synergy out. You get access to more win cons than you do in something like Roxai necessarily, because you get to do those, you know, Hullbreaker Horror, Tevesh stuff, which again, that's something you might want to point out to a new player, but still, once they see that or they understand that, not going to be complicated for them at all. Not necessarily the easiest deck in the world. Again, any deck where at points you need to be proactive, push an early Nas, push an early Breach win, it's going to have complexities to it. But I think the fallback of, oh man, my thing didn't work out. Well, I guess, you know, I can cast my commander and, you know, try to rebuild. I think this is a great deck for new people. It's a little bit on the trickier side, but it's also like the deck that represents the full range of power and cool stuff you get to do in cEDH while also being pretty approachable. Najeela, depending on the build, I think could be strong but tricky to not ideal. I think the more turbo you are, then it becomes closer to not ideal. But I do think having that A+B in the command zone really helps new players just know that, like, you know what, kind of no matter what you're doing, you can probably just go get Derevi or Grim Hireling. You know, you have to know what's on the board, how many warriors you have, if you can, you know, count up to that. But does have a trickier pivot plan, right? Because you are pivoting between a commander focused game plan with creature combos, going for things like Ad Nauseam, going for a pure Breach win, pure Thoracle win. So you have a lot of different things you can do, but they overlap really well. And a lot of the times, one of the strengths of Najeela is you can do one plant. Like, you can, developing Najeela is just good. So you can do that part, beat people up while working towards any of the other plans that present themselves to you. It's a deck that gets to do combat wins, which I think new players tend to like a lot. I do think it's on the trickier side. Again, having that simplicity of, yeah, if you get this in your commander and you can hit people, you win. Very easy for a new person to gravitate towards that and understand it. This wouldn't be the first deck that I would hand to a new person, but especially with like getting them a few games, if they've watched cEDH gameplay before, they understand how Breach works and Ad Nauseam is supposed to be used and things like that. It's not going to be tough for them to pick up Najeela versus some of these other lists. So a deck I would be willing to hand to a new person for sure. Let's go ahead and do a controversial one. I think Godo at this point is bait. I think it's the last one of those kind of monocolor decks that people throw at new people. At least like the people who actually think about the new player experience. They still do it. Some people still promote other decks that kind of suck, but Godo has one top 16. I mean, it has like a 5% conversion rate. Got one win last year and it had people talking about it, but it had no other results all of last year as well. Like it's had, I think, two top 16s in the last year and a half or something, maybe 2 years. It's not a great deck. It has a straightforward game plan. There's all kind of complexities. As again, I should have also disclaimed this at the beginning. Every deck has complexities. You know, if you go into the comments saying, well, actually the deck is complex because it can do this, this, and this. Yeah, there's 99 cards and a million different interactions. Of course, every deck has its own complexities. The main game plan of Godo, I think, is almost too simple for new players. I don't think they're going to find it very rewarding. Maybe they will. You just make a bunch of mana and slam the guy down, beat everybody to death. The skills, sure, it gives you a skill of finding your window. Name a cEDH deck that doesn't. Name a cEDH deck that doesn't give you the skill of finding your window. There isn't one. And it's not good now. Maybe, it'll come back and do well, but like, I just think this plan is too all in on one strategy that isn't especially exciting, doesn't seem to be currently especially powerful. Again, I covered this last year and was like, yeah, put it in my top 5, sure, because it is easy. Right now, I don't think I would hand a new person Godo. I don't think they get a lot of the cEDH experience out of it. That's really, at least what I find to be exciting about the format. It's not especially powerful, and I don't think they're going to find it very rewarding to count to 11 and then get Force of Willed. Kenrith, I think, is not ideal. It has a lot of the same draws that other high color piles have. It tends to be, it's the most 5-color pile-y deck in the format. And for that reason, it can just look like a pile of cards to new people. There's so many different combos, so many different game plans you can have. Going for dockside loops with Emil, going with the reanimator loops, which are a little bit more complicated for new people to get. Again, some of them are not, some of them aren't. Like, there are a lot of different game plans that this deck has access to. Especially, a lot of the list, it's not that common you use Kenrith for value, but a lot of people will be used to kind of turboing out their commanders. So depending on the list they pick up, it can be a little misleading to have this big expensive commander. And when I get to cast it, it actually doesn't really do a lot for me depending on the board, especially if I'm newer and I don't really understand how to best utilize Kenrith. I think this is a deck that's just good for people once they understand, they get a good grasp of all the staples, all the different win cons. They've seen a lot of the deck. Not that it's a weak deck by any, stretch of the imagination. It's always in our top 10, basically. I think there's just a bit too much going on for new people. You're going to find cards and be like, how am I supposed to use this? Like, especially if you're going in no primer, no anything. Not the deck I would go to hand to the new person. It's just a little bit too much of a high color pile. You cast a Demonic Tutor in this deck for a new person on turn 1, they're going to be completely lost. They'll sit there for 20 minutes if somebody doesn't say anything. I think another deck I would put in the don't do it tier is Tayam. I think this is a very cool deck. I'm not nearly as much of a Tayam hater as a lot of people are, but this is a very tough deck to play. There's so much going on. If you're new, you want to talk about a deck that has you find your window, right? Tayam players almost never try to win on their own turn because it doesn't make sense. They don't even try to activate Tayam on their own turn half the time. There's a billion overlapping combos. This is like the deck where if you gave it to a new person, you're going to have to find the line for them. It's going to be, unless they have a ton of like legacy experience with, I don't know, some kind of, I don't even know what deck in legacy does loops like Tayam, but they, just have a really strong hit, grasp of the game. Sure, they might be able to pick it up, but the average new player, I'm not handing them Tayam. I think it's significantly stronger than something like Gitrog Monster. There's dedicated pilots who will help you figure out the deck, will help you learn it. If you're just handing a deck to a new person, Tayam is bottom of the list for me, other than decks that are as complicated but worse. Let's do another simple but limited. I'm going to put Malcolm Kedis up here. You could also sub this out for some of the other Malcolm decks. I'd probably put this above Yuriko because I think Malcolm strategies have just shown themselves to be stronger. They got worse with the printing of Bowmasters, but they're decks that have a lot of flexibility. Like the way that they win isn't as simple as just slam Malcolm, slam Glanthorn. Especially like you look at Malcolm Kedis. There's a lot of different ways for that deck to win. Most of them involve Malcolm still, but there's a lot of different ways that you get there. You could play Teamer Malcolm and get access to all the creature tutors that are in green that helps you do it. I really like the mid-range Malcolm Vile decks. Those look really interesting. But yeah, this is a deck that has a really straightforward way to win. It has a actual pretty cool interaction with its two commanders. They feel actually synergistic, which I think new people might have more of appreciation for, that you can generate lots of value, make lots of mana. You can play a longer game plan, and the more interactive a deck needs to be, I think the trickier it is. Arguably, you could put this at excellent tier. I think the only thing holding it back is that Malcolm decks haven't performed that great recently, from holding it back from that excellent tier, at least at a widespread level, but it's pretty dang close. I would say this is probably like the top of simple but limited. Strong deck, hard to interact with. If the table's not ready for it, you're going to sneak in wins. but you also get to, you have a blue deck, you get to interact with it. Yeah, I think it's a good place to start. And again, you could look at Malcolm Vile, like maybe like what won SCG Con, or Malcolm Tana, although that deck has been falling off a little bit, but still has its own strengths. A new deck in Excellent for me, I might be wrong on this. I think I would put Nixilis in Excellent. It depends on your build. The more turbo, kind of tougher, but having a giant value engine in the command zone that just kills players, that has lots of kind of innocuous looking synergy that ends up being this huge generation of value, and having just a 1-card win con with it. I think a lot of that leads to this deck being great for new players. It's pretty strong. It's had some top 16s. You could start somebody off with a pretty synergistic version of the deck that would look closer to what they might built in like casual. And then if they want something that's a little bit meatier, you could hand them a more turbo version of the build that has less of the bad cards and is more just like, here's your Adnaz, go for an early breach win, Yogg will, lots of that stuff. Maybe you might say that it's too synergistic in some of those builds and too turbo in the other builds to be good for new players. But I think somewhere in the middle of those builds, depending on the person, there's like a really great deck to hand a new person where they probably have seen this commander. They understand what triggers it. They understand what makes it good. You get access to cards and you get a really big flyer that can kill people. I feel pretty comfortable putting it in Excellent. Let me know if you disagree down below. Now, a deck I don't feel comfortable putting in Excellent, even though it's very powerful and I love it, is Sisay. Sisay is not ideal at all for new people, bordering on bait. This deck just has too much going on for a new person, I think. Again, if you love it, if you're like, I'm playing Sisay no matter what, sure, you got it. This is know what to tutor for the deck. That's what this deck does. Your combo lines, they're a little weird. I think, you would only need it to be explained to you a bit in terms of like the main line you're trying to assemble, but the different ways that you have to get there's a ton. The different things you need to know how to play against. It's a deck that has, multiple cards that almost completely shut it out, like Drannith and Opposition Agent. You have answers for those, but of course, like new player, they get their deck shut down one time. It doesn't take much, right? The fallback plan of just cast Legendary, cast some Planeswalkers, it can work, but if your hand's not built for it, then it's not built for it. I think it's an awesome deck, one of the coolest decks in the format. Don't think it's a great place for a new player to start unless they are just obsessed with Sisay and really, really want to do it, and they're okay to lose a few times while they learn the deck. I hate to say it, but I think Crick is bait. I think a lot like Godo, this deck is both very all in on what it does. Sure, you can build it more resilient, sure, whatever. Has no top performances to speak of in the last year, based on the check that I just ran. Doesn't have very straightforward ways that it wins. There are some more than others, but you have like lots of weird reanimator loop lines that have almost no crossover with other cEDH decks. There's just not a lot here other than like, again, this is a deck where like, oh my gosh, I built Crick and it's too powerful for my playgroup. I want to build it in a cEDH. Obviously, that's a good place for you to start. You don't need me to tell you that. In terms of just like, hey, random player, you want to learn how to play cEDH, here's Crick. I don't think that's a good place to start, people. And I'm going to get it out of the way too. I have Selvala here representing mono green. I also think it's bait. I think for years, people have gotten a little bit better at it. For years, people would recommend mono green as a way to get into the format because it's cheap and it's good and it's easy. Cheap, not really as relevant. Format's pretty proxy friendly. Easy, not, especially depending on which of these commanders. You could look at Selvala, Yeva, Nissa, probably the easiest of those, maybe the most easy to recommend, but that might almost have the Godo problem of being a little too straightforward. And it's not good. They don't really have many results. There was a Yeva, the top 16, and it was like, there was like a celebration in my comment sections that a mono green deck had finally done something, right? That's when you know that strategy is not too powerful, is when I throw a mono green deck in the thumbnail, people are freaking out. The combo lines don't have a lot of overlap in really many of the mono green decks because the mono green combos are just their own thing. Other decks aren't running Ashaya, Quirion Ranger things because there's way better things to do in the format. Not especially easy to pilot. They can be pretty all in depending on the commander. Very easy to disrupt. I just don't think they're a great place to start. Heliod here is just representing hard Stax as an archetype. I think I would put in the top of don't do it. Stax, we've talked about it. It's not even really an archetype at the moment in terms of like you actually look at tournament results. It barely shows up, especially if you don't consider Tayam Stax, which all the Tayam players swear it's a mid-range deck. Hard Stax is just not in a great place at the moment. It's very tricky for a new player to pick up. It's like, hey, I've never played Modern before. Well, here's a control deck. I don't know what these cards are. How do I control something I don't understand? You don't even have very experienced players playing these decks right now, at least not at the level where they're showing up in top 16 or even in a high density of just showing up. There's no outlier to point to like a Winota anymore. Again, you can point to Tayam. Sometimes that deck doesn't even perform that great. And again, that is a very non-new player friendly deck. Some of these are tricky, right? I actually think Krark Sakashima is closer to the bottom of not ideal than it's either bottom of not ideal or top of bait. Because this is a deck that has been, if you've been paying attention to my top 16s, this is a deck that's been on the comeback. Unlike these other decks below it, I think this is a deck where when I see it in the top 16, I'm never shocked. I think it's just really hard to play. Again, you have Storm experience, whatever. Sure, you can pick up Krark Sakashima. This is a deck where a lot of times the new players will just stumble their way into board states where everyone else is just like, you got it, I'll concede. If they have to play it out, though, they might have a panic attack. This is just a very tricky deck to pilot successfully. There's a lot of technical skill involved. There's a lot of logistics that you might not have to know about in other games where like the way that the stack works and triggered abilities happen and the way that all this resolves is very relevant. And if you take it into an event, you don't know what you're doing, you're going to get a bunch of judge calls because they'll do things slightly out of order. But it is still like a deck that you can play. There are pilots who play it and they will top 16. So it's hard to put it in debate when it works and it's doing well currently. So I'd say if you're new, probably lean towards something a little bit simpler first. Maybe go to like Malcolm Kedis or Niv Mizzet over Krark Sakashima until you learn the format a little bit better. But this is definitely a deck you can aspire to play or, try out if you're new. Be willing to put in those reps. Dargo Thrasios is tough. Part of me wants to put it in like excellent, but also like team or win cons are a lot of like tutor for tutor for tutor. So I kind of want to put it in strong but tricky. Maybe I'm wrong on this one, but this is a deck that has performed pretty well, but its win cons are kind of like Dargo loops can be tough. You have to do Dargo math. You're having to like, okay, what does Neoform get me here? What does Eldritch Evolution get me here? Can I Neoform my 2-drop into an Eternal Witness to get back my Neoform to do this for this? Their win cons are a little awkward compared to some of these other decks, right? You don't have this very, very simple win that is very, is relatively hard to interact with, right? A lot of the decks don't even run like Dualcaster Mage, right? So a lot of the traditional A+Bs aren't even there. They're doing like Breach wins or they're doing a Dargo loop. I guess you could consider Kinnan Basalt as an A+B. So I guess there's that at least. Maybe this should be an excellent. Again, these tiers are the same. So you could look at this as like in the top 5 probably. The non-black Thrasios decks just have so much utility. It can be kind of hard to navigate with like, well, what do I do with a Neoform in this scenario? Am I going for a Thrasios kind of game plan? Am I going for a Dargo game plan? Those are strengths of the deck, but they are complexities also. So I'm going to say strong but tricky. Let me know if you think it goes in excellent. Maybe you think it's simple but limited. There's just tricky lines when you're doing what's sometimes a Thrasios grind deck and sometimes a pure manual storm deck. Tymna Tana, I think it's bait. Bloodpod just hasn't had results recently. It's not necessarily hard stacks, but stacks adjacent, right? It's, really tempo-y kind of stacks pieces that don't so much affect me. But then a lot of the builds, they do affect you, depending on what you're doing, right? If you're null rotting and you're birthing pod, that tension there is going to trip up new people. It trips up the actual dedicated pilots. Like this isn't a deck that's had very good results. It shows up sometimes. It's got top 16s. I'm not going to say it's bad. Maybe it should go into top of not ideal. I think the combination of it not performing great, it has some performances in combination with kind of how tricky this deck is. A lot of the complexities that the Dargo Thrasios deck had or Kenrith had are present here, but it's also with the layered complexity of like, oh, well, there's an Archon of Ymir in my deck. Like there's stacks pieces in here. How do I develop these? What do I need to do for the board? Questionable power level and stacks complexity that makes it very hard to recommend for a new player. Although it is a super cool deck. This is one of the first decks I saw and I was like, wow, this is awesome. Like a lot of people watch Play to Win and they wanted to play this deck, but it's just not in a great place right now. And again, it's just kind of tricky for a new player. This is a deck I would say more than any of these others in the bait tier. If you're really dedicated to wanting to play Bloodpod, it is good enough. But I think it's just weak enough also and complex enough to maybe want to put it in debate. Magda's really tricky. This is like probably the top of not ideal. This is really hard. This might be the hardest one to evaluate. Maybe it's even strong but tricky. Doing the Magda game plan, once you've had the combos explained to you, they're not incredibly complicated in terms of the basics. You need a artifact dwarf. You need your clock. You need Magda. Let's go. The deck is actually on a huge tear right now. Unless something crazy happens, this is going to be in our next top 10 for the first time. And it has like a 35% conversion rate. It has like 10 top 16s. It's going crazy this year. The stacksier your build is, the tougher it's going to be for a person to pick up. Knowing when to tutor for that stacks piece instead of going for your win. That's going to require a lot of reps, a lot of understanding of the format, a lot of understanding what your stacks pieces are doing. If you're playing stuff like Blood Moon and Magus of the Moon, deploying those at the wrong time will lose you the game. But you can also play Magda just more proactively, not really think so much about the stacks pieces, especially the ones that are questionable and who they hit at the table. Then I think it just goes straight up to strong but tricky. So I'm okay with either of these. So let me know which one you would put it in. Strong but tricky, non-ideal. I'm going to leave it in non-ideal because so many of the builds are slanting staxy, and that's a complexity there. And maybe if I did this list in like a few months, it would be in strong but tricky. Currently, I'm going to say non-ideal. I sat here a while trying to figure out where to put Talion. I'm going to slam it into the top of non-ideal because it is a weird combination of very easy to grasp what makes your commander strong and why you want it. Very commander-centric in that regard, but it's also playing a very dedicated control strategy. Like, it's the control deck that we've seen so far. Strong, but not top tier. It's like tier 2.5 or something. Not the hardest to understand what makes it strong, but can be hard to play that control game plan until you understand what you need to be answering. Like, if you don't understand the threats of the format, it's made easier by the just raw density of cards that you get to see. This is one that almost evades my categories, though, in terms of where I think it really lines up. All right, now these last three are tough because I think Marneus, I mean, this is another deck that's been doing well. Tivit's been a deck that's kind of declined but does well. Atraxa, these decks are all almost like the same thing. Atraxa is probably the trickiest. Strong but tricky Atraxa. This is a deck. It has straightforward way to win with food chain, but it's not a food chain deck where you can just raw consult for food chain and then don't care about what's in your deck. You have to care about it. Lots of pivoting. It's got that neoforming issue that we talked about where there's like, okay, well, what do I go grab? But it is a strong deck. It keeps performing. Strong but tricky for Atraxa. Tivit is a deck that has dropped, but like, hey, develop early Tivit, go for time sieve. You have all the good Esper cards. Like Tivit, I feel safe putting in somewhere in excellent. I'm not sure exactly where I'd order it. You get to have access to like the best win con in terms of Thorkel consult. You don't get Breach, which is the real best win con, but whatever. That's also a more complex win con. Time Sieve as a 1-card combo with the commander, and it's very efficient. You're in good colors. Powering out the commander is a game plan. That's just the thing you can do. That's a great fallback, but you're also not, I can't play my commander. You know, it got Dranith, it got countered. I can't play the game anymore. No, you have a Esper list that can sit around behind a Ristic or Mystic and draw some cards and generate mana and try to go nuts. This is a deck that if I cover this in a month or two and it has results similar to what it's had lately, it could go up into excellent. Right now, again, remember, these tiers are interchangeable. I'm going to go with Simple but Limited here for Marneus. It has a lot of the same strengths of Tivit. It doesn't quite have like as easy of a, I just win the game thing. You can do Hullbreaker loops, but again, Tivit has that as well. A little bit less of a focus on like, well, if I just get my commander, eventually I'll win. But you also have that. You have really great synergies with Smothering Tithe, things like that. Though you do have a lot of triggers that are easy to miss with Marneus. For now, simple but limited, but if this deck continues to perform the way it's performing right now, I would put it into excellent right there with Tivit, because they are similar decks. Marneus just doesn't seem to have the same results. This is my list. I think it's mostly ordered. It's tricky to order some of these, but in terms of the categories, I feel pretty good about them. Magda, Marneus, and Talion were the hardest, I think. But for the most part, yeah, those top 4 decks, I would, in terms, like if I had to make a pod, and you see this question posed a lot. Hey, what 4 decks would you make for a pod for new players? I would just do this 4. Kinnan, Tevesh, Kraum, Nixilis, Tivit. You have the one green deck is the one that has the least confusing aspect of like using green creature tutors. All of these decks have straightforward win cons. Most of them have something close to an A+B with their commander. You have Assault Monolith with Kinnan, Tidespout Tyrant, and maybe even Displacer Kitten with Tevesh. You have All B1 with Nixilis. You have Time Sieve and Hullbreaker Horror with Tivit, if you're on that. I think these are great 4 decks to hand to new people. So if you're new, play one of these 4. If you want to switch things up a little bit, maybe you play Yuriko, throw in Dargo Thras if you really like what that deck does. Najeela, Tymna, Atraxa can easily exchange for Tivit as just a somewhat more complicated version of the deck, but that can do really cool, exciting things and has a lot of overlap. Let me know down below if you agree with my list. It's pretty hard. This is a lot of commanders. You try it if you think it's that easy. I had a lot of fun with this. Hopefully this was helpful to you. Let me know what you think, where you would move things around. It's pretty tricky, but yeah, if you enjoyed it, like, comment, subscribe. Lots of more content like this coming up soon. This was a ton of fun. I love doing this kind of thing. If you want to see more tier list stuff like this, let me know. I'd be happy to do it, especially if you have a specific idea of one you want me to do. All that being said, thank you guys so much for watching. And as always, go play cEDH. Have a good one, everybody.